December 1996. If there is a public case that has fascinated the public for decades, it's this one, the JonBenét Ramsey murder. It's been decades now. The case remains open, and it remains a subject of great fascination to not only those of us who cover true crime, but those of us who follow true crime, the audience who can remember the case, but now a whole new generation of people, thanks to Netflix specials and some of the developments, have hooked into this case in hopes that it may someday be solved. Now, we have an expert on the case and an expert legal mind. We have Joshua Ritter here to walk us through not only the history, but where it might be going, because believe it or not, after all of this time, there may be some developments possible. So, Josh, you and I know each other. First of all, very good to see you again, buddy.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So help us set the scene. Like I said, it's a long time ago. We're talking the day after Christmas, 1996, and this horrific discovery in Denver, in Colorado. The family wakes up to discover JonBenét not where they left her. She's 6 years old. How does it go?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a nightmare. I mean, it's every parent's nightmare. They wake up December 26th, their 6-year-old's not in her bed. It looks like she had slept in her bed, but she's not there. Mother starts looking around the home and discovers downstairs there is a note, and opens the note, and it's a 2.5-page long ransom note. And
right.
You can't, I mean, I can only imagine what is going through their minds at that point. The sickness in their stomach, the panic about what possibly has taken place. She immediately wakes up her husband, John. This is Patsy who discovers the note, wakes up her husband, John. They call the police almost immediately, despite the instructions in the ransom note. And it is initially, and we're going to get into how this kind of changed over time, but it's initially very much treated like a kidnapping, like a missing persons. They are calling authorities, they're calling neighbors, they're just trying to figure out where their daughter is.
And, you know, that's one of the rubs in this case as the initial investigation unfolds, because, as you say, it's perceived as a missing. So what they're thinking is that, okay, and then when I say that, I mean the cops, all right? The police show up, as you say, they're called, they show up. They're thinking that of course, the house is going to be important. But they're thinking, okay, she's potentially alive. There's a ransom note. And so the action is going to be offset. It's not going to be in the house. And yet it goes that way, and it ends up being a real impediment to the investigation. So take us from there. What happens next?
No, you're absolutely right. They did not treat the home, to your description, like a crime scene.
Right.
They didn't remove everyone from the house. There were neighbors that showed up. There were family members that showed up. People were helping to clean up the house because they're just trying to help the family in their time of need and concern. So potential evidence is being moved around. Things are being cleaned up. No one is treating this house as if it's a crime scene, because they're thinking, like you said, the crime scene is probably elsewhere, and they don't need to be all that concerned with the home. And that's on law enforcement, really, because they believed it wasn't a potential murder scene. Obviously, at this point, it's still a missing person, but they didn't even believe the home was a crime scene. And they're not treating it that way. They're not removing witnesses. They're not preserving evidence. But then as time goes on, in fact, hours later, they instruct John, the father, let's take another look around the house. Let's see if there's anything potentially outstanding to you that might be helpful in trying to locate her. He goes down to the basement. This house, and I think that's also important too, is laid out almost like a maze. It's not a very straightforward floor plan. So you have to go down to the basement. The basement has several different rooms. He goes into through a room they call the train room, where he had like a model train set up. And there's a room that has been locked. Opens that door and makes this nightmarish discovery of finding JonBenét. She is underneath a blanket. She is dead, and she has a rope, a garrote around her neck. And again, the problems with preserving the crime scene, he immediately grabs her. She's got tape on her mouth. He rips that tape off. He grabs her, runs her upstairs in kind of the vain hope of seeing if she can't be resuscitated. Right. She's obviously been dead for hours, but again, all of that potential evidence has been disturbed.
And all of it's understandable. Here's a father who discovers his child, and he scoops the kid up. He scoops up JonBenét and runs her upstairs. One of the things we should recognize is the family has money, and the house is big, right? He's a big executive. I remember the pictures of the house. It's kind of like a mansion, and so it's cavernous. There are all these nooks and crannies. The father is a computer graphics executive who's very well off. Patsy is a former beauty queen. That's the mother. And, the thing that I remember coming out relative to this case that really, I think, hit the public consciousness is as the case developed and it became clear, okay, it's not a kidnapping, it's a homicide, and it's not one of those ones that seems to be amenable to a quick solve. We've all heard the 48-hour rule and all of that. But very often that is the case. But it's a child. But then there were the images of JonBenét having participated in these child pageants. And if you were sitting where I think the general public was sitting, including myself, they were kind of jarring because she's 6 years old. So do you recall any of that? I mean, I'm older than you are, but are you up on the fact that those images came out and the country was kind of like, what the hell?
Yeah, no, immediately. And this is kind of the beginnings, too, of the media's role in all of this, because like you said, it was a case that really captured the attention of the nation and the media ran with it. I mean, daily articles, news coverage, news specials, daytime television was all over this. And a lot of that did seem to kind of focus around the idea that she was this child beauty queen and took part in these childhood pageants. And I don't think you could find a picture of JonBenét where she wasn't all made up with her hair and makeup and in a pageant. There was never one photograph I think the media showed where she looked like a normal 6-year-old girl. Right. And this image kind of became the driving force behind all of this, that somehow that was a nefarious thing that she was participating in, and that may have played a role in her either kidnapping and murder, or perhaps, even more sinister, her parents' involvement in it, which has become, to this day, like you said, it is still a case that is speculated on by people online and in the true crime community. I
remember, this is in the era of, obviously, before our streaming services and everything else. Magazines were very big. She was on the cover of every magazine, and I still have this image in my head of People magazine, her name plastered there, and she was on a series of, apparently, I believe, People magazine covers. And they were all pageant pictures. Right. And what it felt like is, from the perspective of the general public, is that there was this niche subculture that you didn't realize existed of child beauty queens. And I think there was a reflexive thing in the media where there was an impulse to, I don't want to say blame initially the homicide on the parents or on Patsy, but there was discomfort with how she was portrayed, and it became very easy to go from, I don't like this 6-year-old kind of being sexualized, let's be frank, and then the fact that Patsy had been a beauty queen. And so that connection was made very quickly, and as you say, the parents became a subject of investigation and a tremendous amount of speculation. So let's segue into the investigation, because now we're past the initial stage. The cops have shown up, and look, I want to put it on record. I'm sympathetic here. It's undeniable that they could have done things better and differently, the police that responded. Okay, you always want to make a crime scene larger. That's the general rule, as opposed to smaller, and then you can always shrink it later. But, having responded to things like suicides and stuff like that, and, you have the parents there or family members there, it's very difficult to say something like, okay, your daughter is dead. All of you have to get out of the house. Right. Or your daughter is missing. We're going to treat this. Yeah, you have a ransom note, but, it could be a homicide. Everybody out. And we're sealing the house. That's a big step. And so, I do think that we do have to bear in mind now, look, having people coming in and out of the house, people cleaning up, people bringing over food. They had a victim's advocate come over and things like that. Not great. And all of that is pertinent to where the investigation goes. So now it's clear we got the homicide. And there are a number of nodes here that we can talk about relative to what the homicide investigators are presented with. So take us through that. The homicide guys show up. Now they have a body that's DOA. They have the parents there. They have a contaminated crime scene. There are some things that were in play, where they found her, the note, how she died. They have some stuff to go on. So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, well, first they have the body, and like I said, she has been according to the medical examiner, her death was through asphyxiation, but also through a fracture to her skull. So it looks like she was hit over the head, fractured her skull, severe damage there, but the actual death was facilitated through this, what I described as a garrote. And that becomes important because the part of the way that this garrote was made was through a broken paintbrush taken from the home. Right. So this is kind of the evidence that they have to go on initially with the body itself. Later on, they then learned that there was possible evidence of maybe even sexual assault as part of the murder.
Right.
But I think the first piece of evidence that's really what they focus on is this ransom note, because it is so remarkable and so different from their experience with ransom notes. The first being, it is very long. It's 2.5 pages long, right. Handwritten. I mean, you just got to think about the amount of time it takes someone to write that note.
Right.
The other evidence they soon find out is that it was written inside the home because it's taken from a piece of paper on a pad inside of the home, because they see a almost like a first draft attempt at writing this note later on in the pages of that same pad of paper. So now they have a person who killed her, wrote this ransom note either before or after, but took some time to write the note. And then the other thing about the note is it's just bizarre in its language. It's very detailed. It adds a bunch of kind of superfluous language, but it requests $118,000. Such a specific number, not a round number. And that is where kind of their investigation begins, is with this note. Is it, their questions are, is this a for real attempt at ransom? Was this to try to throw investigators off? Or immediately their suspicions, and again, I agree with you, I'm not trying to blame the investigators here, but their suspicions immediately turn towards the family, as is statistically kind of where these investigations go. And they start to wonder if the note was written by either the mother or father, again, in an attempt to throw off investigators.
Now, what is the significance for our listeners who don't know of the $118,000 number? Because that's something in this we gotta explore.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, depending on which reports you believe, it sounds like either investigators soon find out or John Ramsey himself tells them that number is very similar to a bonus he had received from his company. Right. He had received a bonus of $118,000 plus change. And so for the ransom note to be asking for that very specific amount, it seemed to the Ramsey family and what they told investigators that this person must have known about his finances. Right. I mean, the other thing about the note, too, is the note refers to the Ramseys, calls John by his name, refers to JonBenét. This person, whoever wrote the note, knows the family. In other words, it's not written by someone with no knowledge of who they were.
Right. So what is, before we explore a little bit the 118, what is some of the superfluous language? And because it's a rambling note, as you say, it's very long for a ransom note. Usually you want to limit that stuff if you're the perp, because you don't want to give detectives to work on, anything to work on. So, what is it that's in that was sort of extraneous?
Yeah, not only do you want to not give detectives stuff to work on, but you are also thinking about the amount of time. That was always my question.
Absolutely.
How long did it take to write this thing? And you're sitting around with perhaps a dead body downstairs in a home that you don't belong in the middle of the night, and you're writing out this note.
Yeah.
But it talks about things like, we have problems with the government and we are an organization. And then it talks about how he better not speak to anyone or his daughter's going to end up dead. If we see you speaking to a dog, she's going to end up dead. Again, adding all of these kind of details and strong language and colorful language that just didn't seem necessary to the purpose of the note if it was in fact a ransom note. The note could have simply said, provide us with $118,000, further details to follow. But instead, it goes on and on to kind of give all this other information that, again, to this day, I don't think people really understand the purpose of it.
And, I would argue that very good chance, and you gotta take these leaps in order to move an investigation forward sometimes. I would argue that almost certainly the letter was written after she is deceased, because you're not going to sit in a house of a bunch of sleeping people. You're not supposed to be in there. You got to be awfully comfortable in a house like that. If she is alive still, she's in the bed, you didn't do anything yet, you didn't grab her, that you're going to sit there, you're going to compose this note, you're going to then recompose it because you don't like the first draft, you're going to make all of these threats. So it feels to me like it likely is being done after the fact. And this person, it very much crime of opportunity, right? The paintbrush, which is from the house, is used to fashion the garrote. So, the theories that are involved here very much seem to point to somebody who, as you say, knows the family, knows the house, is comfortable in and out of the house, right? And is willing to sit there with a dead body nearby, because at this point now you're on the hook for a murder, and to compose this note. So what do they start to do? Now you have all of these factors, and you have the $118,000, which tracks to his bonus. And, it's the end of the year. It's Christmas, December 26th, so he gets an annual bonus. It must have come in already. So obviously you're talking about somebody close to the family. As you say, this is not something random, some, drifter that wandered into the house. Where do they start to look? Where do they go?
Yeah, almost immediately, it seems like the investigation starts to look at John and Patsy
the parents,
Ramsey.
right.
They seem to be the primary focus. And again, it's understandable. We know that statistically, in most of these cases involving a young child, it's going to be a member of the family. She does actually have an older brother who is interviewed initially by police.
He's about 9 years old, I believe, right?
Yeah.
JonBenét does?
He's 9 years old at the time. There are some theories even still today of his possible involvement. Now, I will say the DA's office has since then absolutely cleared him. Mm-hmm. But the police interview him. They interview the parents, and the parents are initially very cooperative. And I say initially because that doesn't last for very long. Right. Because as this investigation goes on, as the media picks it up, the media turns it into a firestorm almost immediately. Again, they're running with this kind of exploitive nature of the beauty pageants. Right. They begin to focus on the parents, and everything the parents start to do comes under a microscope. I mean, the way that are they grieving properly? Are they not grieving properly? Statements that they make. And now, again, maybe perhaps understandable. I never like to say how a person should and should not behave under these circumstances, because who knows how anybody would behave. But they decide to hire an attorney, and they feel early on that they need help with all of this. And the attorney, as most attorneys do, kind of shuts down all communication. Right. That creates a backlash, and that is immediately seen as being suspicious. And then it's kind of turns into, well, they're not cooperating with authorities. Authorities start to, and we've discovered this since that time, start to kind of leak information in the hope of maybe smoking out the parents. Yeah. But from very early on, it appears as though, even though other suspects were considered, their primary investigation, the full force of it is pointed towards the Ramseys.
It really was. I remember this. And I also remember when they lawyered up, and it became clear that they were going to be a lot less amenable to the investigation, because they got the sense that, hey, they're looking at us here. And I'm taking the position very clearly now. I don't want to take the position of clearing anybody. But, we have to play devil's advocate. If you're sitting where they are and they had nothing to do with it, they're dealing with the death of their child, all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, they think we did this. It's understandable that they would lawyer up, and then the lawyer's just doing his job. But it became very, very easy to put them in the perp box, for lack of a better term, because not only of what you're saying, they didn't seem to be fully cooperating, but then, as I said, there was this discomfort with the fact that all of these photos were coming out of JonBenét, and they just seemed to be really, really unsavory. And the feeling was that, this is how they were living. He was making all kinds of money. She's a former beauty queen. She's reliving her glory days through her 6-year-old daughter. And I can remember videos being shown, and it really felt like this uncomfortable subculture was being revealed to the public, and that was very much part of it. There was a little bit of a feeling of, you know what, even if they're not guilty, they're guilty, because they put the kid out there and advertised her, and some sicko twigged to it. Now, you talked about the fact that there were some other suspects that were looked at, and it becomes a point in this case that maybe they focused on the parents too much initially, but any intel on who else they looked at and any other sort of avenues they were going down relative to the investigation?
Yeah, well, they, once they started to kind of broaden their idea of who could have done this, and they started to look outside the home, they started to think about intruders, and they started to your point, think about who might have been drawn to JonBenét, and perhaps this connection being the fact that she had taken part in these beauty pageants. So one of the people that they looked at was the photographer who had taken a lot of these photographs during the beauty pageants, whether or not that person had any, interest that might be suspicious to police. Right. There were also other assaults and break-ins in that neighborhood. Right. That they started to look at other suspects who may have done this before, a failed attempt. This attempt maybe went too far and ended up in a murder. There were no
she woke up or something. Right.
There were no other murders, but there were other break-ins and there were other attempted assaults. And so they started to look into that too. And then as the years have gone on, there have been other suspects who've, come in and out of the suspicion of police. And later on, a person who became a prime suspect was a man by the name of John Mark Carr. And he had been contacting one of the reporters, documentarians who had been following this case and communicating for him for some time, and said that he was the one responsible. Police were able to, through some very clever work, locate him in Thailand. Mm-hmm. He was arrested. He actually gave a confession. Now, that confession, as you and I know, has to stand up against what do they know independent of media. That's on right. This case. That's he apparently right. Didn't know anything that was independent of media, but they also tested him for DNA, because this case has been, and we can get into it later, but it has been the investigation as the years pass has been guided by the DNA. There was DNA of an unidentified male found on her undergarments. Right. That they have never been able to match to anyone. Now, right. First of all, they've never matched it to any family member of right. the Ramseys. Right. But every suspect that has come up has also not matched to this DNA and has therefore, quote unquote, been cleared by the DNA. Right. So to this day, any suspect that even seems like is remotely good for this doesn't match the DNA in this case.
And that includes Carr.
Right. Carr, right, as well. Carr was cleared, quote unquote, because his DNA did not match that they located at the crime scene.
Yeah, they ultimately wash him out. And, I think probably our audience is aware of this, but this happens in high-profile cases. You get nutbags who decide that they're going to confess to this thing to get their 15 minutes of fame, and then ultimately the police end up washing it out because, look, you want to close the case and everything else, but you got to get the right guy. And as a result, we are left now with what is becoming a cold case. Now, before we get to that and where that goes, I want to go to what happens in 1999, because a grand jury is convened. And that goes in a surprising way here. So can you walk us through real quickly the 1999 grand jury investigation under a prior a prior district attorney, DA, and how that all goes?
Yeah. So this case, not only was the media really heated and overwrought on this case, it became very political in the Boulder area, in the state of Colorado. People wanted this solved, and the politicians were feeling the heat. So the governor actually wanted to have a grand jury convened, and special prosecutors were appointed, because there was a lot of tension between the DA's office there in Boulder County and between the investigators, because the investigators were feeling frustrated. They felt that the Ramseys were good for it. They wanted an indictment brought against them, and the DA was pushing back on it, feeling like they didn't have enough evidence. So they decided to convene a grand jury. Now, this is where things get really interesting. And I have some feelings on this. I'm curious to hear yours, because this evidence is presented to the grand jury. It took quite a bit of time, and it was incredibly thorough, because this has been several years now. So there was a lot of information for them to hear. After the grand jury is done, and there's an announcement that they have come to a conclusion. A press conference is called, and it's you can imagine the kind of media attention. There's satellite cars and thousands of cameras and everything else. And the DA at the time is careful with his words, and he says that there was nothing, that no charges are going to be brought, that he does not feel that the investigation, that the grand jury has left him with the option of presenting, of bringing charges. What we find out later, in fact, years down the line, is the grand jury had in fact returned an indictment, not for murder, but for something where it was they believed that they had somehow put their daughter in a position where this could have happened. It's almost like a child abuse charge.
It was a strange child abuse charge. Yeah.
It was like this idea that they either knew who was involved and was not helping in the investigation, or allowed her to be in a position where she could have come into the way of harm. It was very bizarre. The prosecutor, though, has since then said, listen, and this is where I do agree with him, because it's an important role of a prosecutor. He's saying that, listen, an indictment is a probable cause determination, which is a far less standard than beyond a reasonable doubt. And just because you have a grand jury saying, we believe there's probable cause for this lesser crime, not a murder, but a lesser crime, he felt that that was not something that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt in court at trial. So therefore, he made the decision himself, in spite of the indictment returned by the grand jury, to not bring charges, which is the prerogative of the DA's office.
Prosecutorial discretion.
Absolutely. And I think part of the job of a prosecutor is to be that initial gatekeeper. It's not just about, hey, I've been given an indictment, I'm going to go ahead and pursue this. It's about making a decision, even if those decisions are very difficult and maybe not politically advantageous, to say, I don't believe we could bring a viable case here beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the decision that he made.
So, you asked how I feel about it. I agree with you. It's a strange charge that doesn't really resolve the ultimate question here. And you and I both know that, as the old saying goes, you can indict a ham sandwich. And, that is, in this case, a very, very low bar for a very, very serious crime. And, there is a little bit, it's easy for a grand jury to indict. They don't have to prove the case, but it's the DA who's going to be, or in this case, special prosecutor, who's going to be looking at the case and say, I'm the one who has to present this thing in court. And if this thing crashes and burns fast, which I think it likely would have, he's going to be the person who has to face that music. But the detectives, the investigators, Boulder PD, they don't like it. And we end up with some resignations and a little bit of controversy there. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple of resignations. So one of the lead investigators for Boulder was a man by the name of Steve Thomas. He really believed in the guilt of the Ramseys, and he had a theory. His theory had to do with bedwetting. That he had this theory that she had. JonBenét had wet the bed, that the mother became upset, that she struck her, and then that caused more injury than she thought, and then ... she had to kill her, ... write the ransom note to cover it up. It was a really complex, kind of convoluted theory, but he felt very strongly about it. And when the decision was made to not bring charges after this even indictment from the grand jury, he resigned. Another investigator by the name of Lou Smith came out of retirement to independently investigate this. He felt just as strongly that the parents shouldn't have been indicted. He felt that there was strong evidence to support the theory of a home invasion. And he was so adamant about it that when it looked initially like he might not have the opportunity to testify at the grand jury himself to tell jurors this, he resigned. And so, like I said, this is a case that a lot of people have become really dug in on their feelings on it.
Yeah, you get these cases, and this stuff happens, I think, more than people realize. It doesn't happen this publicly, and you don't get all these resignations, but there very often is internal dissent, and you have experienced investigators who are dealing with experienced prosecutors. You were a prosecutor yourself, and sometimes everybody digs in. They go to their corners, and, it reminds me a little bit of the Alec Baldwin case, where he had that shooting. You had you had like three different prosecutors on that. And ultimately, it ends up going nowhere. But it was a similar thing. People resigned. Everybody's fighting, and it just doesn't help the case move forward. So ultimately, where it ends up is they come back with a true bill. They're saying we have an indictment. It's not the charge. It tracks to a murder. The DA says no dice, and the case kind of goes cold. But then what happens is science starts to develop. And when I say science, we all know I'm talking about DNA. And so here you have this cold case. It's still in the background. Everybody, in the public life, everybody is aware of it. Patsy Ramsey tragically dies of ovarian cancer without any resolution to the case. So, she never gets that satisfaction, or she's never found out if, in fact, she is the perpetrator. We have to allow for all possibilities here. But father, John Ramsey, is still alive, and DNA becomes the focus of the case. And, it's a possibility here that we may get some movement. So take us through where that's been going since.
Yeah, so initially, this happened back in 1996. This was kind of the real infancy years of DNA as it was used forensically. The DNA has been around and they've been able to understand it and use it, but the idea of using it to match to a person to then criminally charge that person was still at its infancy. We're still talking 1996. We're talking about around the same time as the OJ trial, where the DNA there was still under a lot of kind of skepticism by jurors. So as time has gone on, they've been able to kind of develop this profile that's been recovered. Again, the only thing that we ever know is that it has been described as unknown male DNA. They ran it through the CODIS system, which they do, but CODIS is only as good as what's in the system already. So as long as there's known felons, known sexual offenders, they can, other suspects linked to other crimes, other unknowns linked to other crimes, they're going to be in that system. It comes back for nothing. So we've got nothing in CODIS. We've got nothing against any of the family members, nothing against any of the suspects. And we're at this point where now what do we do with this unless something falls in our lap and we can test it against this DNA? Well, as DNA advances, there's now this new kind of way of using it called IgG, or where you use genetic genealogy to not just say, is there a match for this person, but can we run this DNA to match to relatives of this person and reverse engineer a family tree. Famously, this was done in the Brian Kohberger case, where they were able to not match his DNA initially. The same thing, they ran into the same problems there. No hits in CODIS, so they had to reverse engineer his family tree to be able to match it to their believed suspect before they got confirmatory DNA on that. So they're hoping that something like that might be possible in this case. And
that's why the whole thing is still alive. And John Ramsey himself has been pursuing this. He's been pushing it. He's got a little bit of leverage here because he's known and he was a suspect and maybe still is in some people's minds. And so he's got a platform and he's been continuing to put pressure. He's held a press conference, and as a result, Boulder PD partners with Colorado Cold Case, and they're pursuing that. Now, we have to get a little bit graphic here because we have to talk about why there is a sample here to test. And because, look, I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't know, that a lot of people suspected a sexual motive, right? And so when they process the crime scene, they look for that. But yet, there's no evidence of male semen, but there are apparently some indicia of vaginal injuries. And that becomes part of the theory here. So, walk us through just real quickly, like what that could mean, because, you have this sexualized child. I mean, that's just is what it is. But yet you have the DNA, but is it touch DNA? Like, what do we got here?
Yeah, this is considered to be trace or touch DNA. They believe, again, not to get too graphic, but it is what it is. They believe that paintbrush handle may have been somehow used as a tool in a part of this assault. And so now they have this DNA, and the point that is important is because it's not semen. Is there a reason? Is there some perhaps innocent explanation for how this touch DNA might end up there?
Right.
Investigators went to the point of finding the factory where her undergarments were made to try to see, was there an individual there that sort of could have somehow touched this, that then we would have seen this kind of transfer DNA, because that's the point when you have touch DNA, is it can be transferred. And so could it have been a direct transfer from the actual perpetrator touching her and leaving his DNA there, or could have been the perpetrator touching an object that then from that object transferred to her? And this, again, I think is the problem with this DNA being kind of the most important tool as it's been perceived to now. Where I get uncomfortable is when this DNA is used to clear someone, because they are going under the assumption that this DNA has to be the perpetrator.
It has to be the perp, right.
Right. And if it's not a match to their suspect, then that is not the perpetrator. Well, you and I both know DNA can end up sometimes some places. It's circumstantial evidence. So it cannot be said to be the only tool used in an investigation. But if they're using it to clear otherwise viable suspects, they might be clearing someone who's good for this.
And in fact, we've had genealogical DNA cases. I know of at least one. It was down in Texas. It was a rape case where they arrested the wrong guy. They used IgG, and they said, okay, it worked. Here's our guy. They got him, and ultimately it was demonstrated it was not him. Because IgG is a combination of science, but then typical gumshoe police work, right? As you say, you end up with a profile. And that profile doesn't go necessarily to your perp. It goes to the family tree. And then you got to look through this family tree to see, okay, who in the family tree might have had access, might have been in the area, might know the family, would know about the 118. And if you use it the wrong way, not only can you get the wrong guy, but as you say, you could clear the wrong person. I also think the stuff that you articulate here is so important, because it occurs to me that this is likely where the grand jury came up with this strange abuse charge, because these facts were presented and there was some indication that, okay, she might have had previous injuries. There may have been some historic abuse or something like that. And I think that's probably what they were wrestling with. And it felt to me quite speculative, didn't resolve the case at hand. And I think that's likely why the DA just said to himself, you know, I can't go forward on this homicide case on the speculation that these injuries, which there's a lot of debate about. There are just as many people saying, no, that is not a past injury. That's just normal. And so it became very, very murky. So look, button us up now. I think we've run through pretty much the majority of the case and the vectors throughout this whole thing. But that's where we resolve to. Right now, it looks like, despite the fact that you and I have some discomfort with the idea that IgG is the be-all and end-all, right? That this is going to be the hand of God that's going to tell us what it is. Unfortunately, right now, short of a confession or some real blockbuster development, that's what we're left with. So you've been on all sides of criminal cases. You are a prime DA. You do defense work. You know the vectors that blow through something like this. You think it ever gets solved? Make a prediction. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think that if the DNA is what everyone's pinning their hopes to, I don't know if that, like you said, is going to be that final divining rod to lead us here. In these cases, and you know this too, that as years go on, sometimes people can't keep their mouth shut. And sometimes a person gets arrested for an unrelated reason, and then they end up on the radar of police. Maybe this DNA will be important. Maybe we will get a match one day, and I am hopeful that IgG technology can lead them towards another suspect. But again, it's only as good as what other information do they have about that suspect.
Right.
That's why it was so important in the Brian Kohberger case, is that it wasn't just that his DNA was found on that knife sheath. It was that Oh, by the way, that same guy doesn't have a rock solid alibi for where he was at 3 o'clock in the morning. That same guy drives a vehicle similar to our suspect vehicle. That same guy had his cell phone, multiple times within the same area. That same guy bought a knife on Amazon.
Right.
Those were the reasons that case was so powerful.
Right.
And I think that if there is a break in this case, the IGG will hopefully help them zero in on a suspect. But it's going to be, like you said, real tenacious, old-fashioned police work that will put this together. If you're asking me to give you a prediction, somehow a part of me just says this is not going to be one of those cases that remains unsolved. I feel
Really?
even these many years later, I feel that somehow something will come out because it is a case that just continues to capture people's attention. And with that much modern-day attention and online armchair detectives working on it, I just feel like maybe we'll get some break someday.
Well, that's heartening because I actually was feeling the other way. I felt like if we don't have it by now. But look, the genealogical, we're sort of denigrating IGG as the be-all and end-all, but it is powerful.
Yeah.
And you may end up with a pool of people that you can look at, and then you find out this guy's been arrested 3 times since. And one thing about IGG is that if you do have a sample, and let's hope it's not too degraded, that they can culture it and use it. You have the option of the 1-to-1. Remember, they had genealogical in Koberger, but ultimately when they arrest him, they take a cheek swab and they match it to the touch DNA. It's funny, Koberger has become, because the case facts are so well known, the touchstone here for what we use as to say, well, that's how it worked there. It can work here, but that's a good shorthand. They were able to take a cheek swab of him, match it 1-to-1 to the knife sheath that had his touch, and the odds of it not being Brian Koberger, who was at that scene and touched that sheath, were greater than the grains of sand on planet Earth. Which is pretty compelling evidence.
Pretty strong stuff.
So if we can get to a similar circumstance here, I hope you are right. And, let's keep the faith on it. You got a lot of good people working on it. You have Colorado cold case on it. My understanding is that they were a real sharp outfit, and they are pursuing this, and everybody does want it solved. And while John Ramsey is alive, you have to hope that if, in fact, this will ultimately... And they were cleared, by the way. We should mention that the DA's office ultimately did clear the parents. I think that it would be divine justice for him to get that, get that resolution. Josh, listen, man, we appreciate it. Your knowledge of the case is so deep, and your knowledge of how to handle this stuff is so invaluable. You made it easy on me. It was great to see you. We appreciate you being here again, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you again.